So if you allow me to do a little bit of review, one of the things that Paul has been talking about in chapter 3 of 2 Timothy is the danger of people that are coming in the end times. And part of that danger is certainly related to the kind of people that would step into positions of leadership and influence within the church. And the scary thing is, as I talked about for a couple of weeks there, going into detail, that Paul has this lengthy list of some 20 things that he says are basically really kind of the personality characteristics of what we would call today narcissistic sociopaths, or simply that they're sociopathic. They have antisocial personality behavior, which doesn't mean that they aren't personable. It doesn't mean that they don't like to hang out with people. In fact, they can be extremely charming and personable. But the reality is it's all for a motive. They really don't like you. They don't really like people in general. They convince people that they're their very best friend, but in fact, you're just simply something for them to use for another purpose. So people are utilitarian, relationships are utilitarian. In the end of the day, the only person they really, really care about is their own self. And sadly, those people will throw you under a bus quicker than you can even imagine if it suits their purpose. And that's one of the things that Paul warned about in the book of Acts in chapter 20, verse 24, when he talks about to the same elders of the church that Timothy is leading. He said that after I leave, he said, there'll be savage wolves that will arise amongst you who will not spare the flock, and they'll seek to draw disciples after themselves. And ultimately, that personality type wants themselves to be the center of attention. They want you to focus upon them. And it's such a sad thing, because in truth, one of the things that I've come to discover and learn to embrace is that people like me, all we are is just simply placeholders in the purposes of God. In other words, by that I mean that God has called me and placed me in the position He's in. He's gifted me to minister to the people who listen to me and feel like God speaks to them. But the bigger issue is that I'm temporary. I'm only going to be here for a season, and I'm at that chronological position right now where I realize that my days are numbered. And so basically, if the Lord tarries and He takes me out of this world, He's simply going to choose to appoint someone else. He's going to pick someone else to be the new placeholder and to carry the ball forward until the end of that person's season, or else the second coming of Christ. And I think in a way it's really important that we understand the dynamics of the church in that way, because so often when a church pastor retires or he passes away or something incapacitates him, there's such a rush to fill the void. People are in kind of a panic, because unfortunately what they've done is they've begun to build the identity of the church around that pastor, his teaching, his personality. I don't know how you completely avoid that, other than the fact that you really learn to wait upon the Lord. And that's really what I think is so significant, is because, as we talked about with the choosing of Saul and then later the choosing of David, Saul was the easy choice and David was the harder and longer choice, but we see the difference in their lives. That what David accomplished was so significant, it led to the golden age of Israel's history. And I think the same thing is true in ministry, that I pray, my prayer is that if God takes me home before He comes for me, that He would appoint somebody who would cause people just to forget that I was even here and just carry forward and continue to reach people for the gospel and teach His church to love His word. Having said all that, Paul turns his attention from talking about these people that you need to watch out for to his own self. And he says to Timothy, he says, "You, however, know all about my teaching, my way of life, my purpose, my faith, patience, love, endurance, persecutions, sufferings, what kind of things happened to me in Antioch, Iconium, and Lystra," because Timothy was with him in those early days, "the persecutions I endured." And one of those persecutions, if you remember, Paul was literally stoned to death and left for dead in one of those cities, the city of Lystra. So Paul is saying to Timothy, he said, you know, you've had an opportunity to know me through and through. You know my strengths, you know my weaknesses. You've seen me on the good days, you've seen me on the bad days. You've seen me when my faith was overflowing, and you've seen me when my faith was in the bottom of the cup. You've seen me in all situations. And it's interesting, as I said a couple of weeks ago, I said Paul was a list maker. I mean, so often in his teaching, he has these kinds of lists. And I think we just take really a moment to try to kind of pass through some of these things. The very first thing he says, you know my teaching. In other words, the things that I communicated to you as a Bible teacher, you know those things are true. And I really think that that's first and foremost. We really can't measure the qualities or the qualifications of somebody to lead until we have an experience with their teaching. In fact, Paul said to Timothy in the first letter, he said in chapter 3 that somebody who's qualified to lead the church has to be able to teach. And that means they have an aptitude, which means they have a gifting. The teaching is not just a communication of information. It's not just an intellectual exercise or an act of eloquence. It's an expression of the Holy Spirit in a kind of giftedness. It's one of the gifts that God gives to people in positions of leadership, that they're able to teach the Word of God and communicate it in a way that uplifts and builds people in the faith. It causes people to focus their life on the person of Christ and upon the words that He's taught in the Scriptures, and not focus it upon the teacher. You see, it's such a difficult thing, because I certainly appreciate and respect the men who taught me and helped me to grow in my faith. I mean, some of you know, like Chuck Smith. There's other people like John Higgins that you probably don't know. But there were men who really had a big role in my life early on, and Lynn Haver, who prayed for me to receive Christ. I mean, there's some really unknown people as well as known that I learned to respect in a great way. But I also came to know that they weren't perfect. And that's why we don't look at moments in people's lives. But he says, secondly, that you know my way of life. You know the trajectory of my life. You see where the focus was, the direction I was heading, that when you looked at the compass, mine was always heading towards Christ. And it doesn't mean that he didn't struggle to find his way as a time, like we all do. But overall, he said, you looked at my life, and the history of my life was that I have been a follower of Jesus. It's really interesting, because where Paul says an elder can't be a new believer, I remember my oldest son said to me one time, and I had never thought of it like this, he says, not only does that text mean new to the faith, but he says it also means new to you. That I don't think a church should pick a leader that they're not familiar with. And that's what Paul is saying. You know my way of life. You know who I am. And thirdly, he says, you know my purpose. What was ultimately the defining objective of my life? And he says that came out in expressions of faith. Where did I put my faith? In the fact that I was patient and waiting upon the Lord. That I had love, which means not only love for God, but love for other people. And I might say that if you're going to love people, you're going to have to forgive people, because people are fallible. And that's why the people who are the most loving are the people who have become the most gifted at forgiving other people their transgressions. And that's why he throws in there, you've also seen my endurance. There is nothing that tests your love than having to endure hardships. And especially when you're talking about relational dynamics, because even in marriage, you have to endure a lot of things. You have to overlook a lot of things. You have to forgive a lot of things. But there's also things that come from the outside. When he said persecutions and sufferings, these are the things that come to us sometimes just as part of life. Like we had these horrible wildfires at the end of summer that destroyed people's homes. Terrible, terrible suffering that these people went through. And even a few people's lives were lost, as even horribly as we saw in Maui. But also these are things that come because people want to do you harm. And he says you have to be aware of that. There are some people who are going to say and do things that are intended to damage you. And he says that you have to endure that. And you have to be careful. You have to watch your heart that you don't allow yourself to become unloving. There are people who will try to engage you and draw you into all sorts of argumentative thing and get you into the flesh. And I came up with the saying many years ago when I was in a situation like where somebody was attacking me pretty voraciously. And somebody asked me how I would respond. I said, well, basically, I've learned that if you don't pick up the other end of the rope, you can't have a tug-of-war. I mean, that's what the problem is. Satan wants you to get engaged in a tug-of-war with people over stupid stuff that later on you're just going to forget. As someone once said, you have to learn how to have the memory of a goldfish, which lasts about 10 seconds. And so it's not like you completely wipe your mind, but you don't allow what's happened to become the reference point through which you interpret the future. You let Christ's word and his promises be your reference point. And that's what Paul was really trying to say to Timothy. He says, Timothy, you're going to go through some tough stuff. You probably already have. But as you look at me and how I've lived my life, let that be an example to you of how you're going to live your life. Whatever you do, And one of my my catchphrases for life is to be steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. And that's really been one of my mantras over the years, that I figured out long ago that if you just sit down and die, that's what's going to happen. But if you're in the middle of a swamp of difficult situations, just keep slogging through, throwing one foot in front of another. Eventually, you'll get out of the swamp. You'll get refreshed, you'll get dry, you'll get filled, you'll get satisfied, you'll feel good, and probably will then have to enter another swamp. But we do that until we leave this earth, but always realizing that as long as I keep on throwing one foot in front of the other, I'm going to make it to the other side. God bless you and go in His grace.